I'm Suman Roy, the Executive Director at Meal Exchange, and it's a pleasure and honor for me to welcome you all. It's really an exciting day ahead. We had an amazing day yesterday with our keynote speaker, as well as our session on how government works. Today, it's really another very interesting day. Our first session is about policies on campus level, how it works, or any other questions that you might have. Please feel free to write down in the chat, and our moderators will address the questions. After that session, our next session is about student food and what students have done on campuses. We have a provincial government policy session and a federal government policy session. So I hope I have you for the day and do some amazing learning, networking, asking questions. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. There is people from all across the country on this and international as well, who is in this session. It'll be great to hear from everybody and see where we are. This session is being recorded. I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement. Can we have that on the screen so people can follow through? Amazing. So the Meal Exchange would like to begin by acknowledging that we are uninvited guests on the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Because we are about to dive into a conversation about food, food systems, and food security, we must also be explicit about the numerous ways in which Indigenous food systems, food sovereignty, and access to traditional foods and traditional practices of hunting, gathering, and fishing have been disrupted by historic and ongoing colonization of Indigenous lands and food systems. No food system can be considered just until Indigenous food sovereignty is acknowledged, restored, and reconciled. As an organization, Meal Exchange recognizes that we have not sustainably embedded reconciliation into our organization's culture and programs. Our organization's intention currently is to begin the internal process of reflection in order to better understand what it means to work towards reconciliation and addressing Indigenous student food security in a meaningful way. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. So without much delay, I would like to introduce you to our moderator for the first session, Sam Laban. Sam manages the Guelph Lab, a joint initiative of the University of Guelph and City of Guelph. He works with City of Guelph staff, university staff, faculty, and students, as well as with citizens of all stripes to develop promising solutions to pressing challenges facing the region. The Guelph Lab has been collaborating on the efforts to address student food insecurity since 2019. Without much delay, Sam, take it over.
Thank you, Suman, and hello and welcome everyone. My work has benefited greatly from the partnership with Meal Exchange over the last couple of years, so I was honored to be invited to moderate this panel today. My first responsibility is to introduce our fellow panelists, so I'm going to do that first. Our first panelist, Dr. Barbara Parker. Hi, Barb. Barb is the Associate Professor at Lakehead University. Her research focuses broadly on food security, health, and critical dietetics. She has conducted research in the post-secondary context to understand the student experience of being food insecure while studying at both the undergraduate and graduate level. She was instrumental in initiating the formation of the Lakehead University Food Security Committee and has been active in her role with this group as a faculty member since 2017. Hi, Barb. Welcome.
Hi, Sam. Thanks.
Our second panelist, Austin Hurley. Austin is the representative for Brock University Student Union on the steering committee of the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, USA. USA is an organization dedicated to advocating for an accessible, affordable, accountable, and high-quality post-secondary sector in Ontario. Welcome, Austin.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. And our final panelist, Sid Mehta. Welcome, Sid. Sid Mehta is the Senior Director of Ancillary Services at Simon Fraser University. He's responsible for empowering the SFU community of 43,000 by leading ancillary services like food, retail, bookstore, printing, mobility, and events. Their mission is to create an engaged and vibrant SFU community by enhancing living and learning experiences. Before joining SFU, he was Executive Vice President at Emerging Ag, Inc., a boutique international consulting firm providing communications and public affairs services to clients in the agriculture, food, and health sectors. Sid led the food and retail engagement at the United Nations, helping clients deliver strategies and tactical solutions on improving food security, reducing food loss and waste, and creating sustainable food systems. Sid has a bachelor's degree in electronics and telecommunications, a diploma in industrial electronics, and holds certifications in Six Sigma Green Belt, financial planning and analysis. He's an EDI influencer and completed the Queen's University Executive Leadership Program. Outside of all of that, Sid is a proud Indo-Canadian, father to 2 exceptional children and husband to a fantastic partner. Sid is an avid tennis player, a foodie who loves to cook, and has traveled to 194 cities worldwide. And rather than joining us from SFU today, Sid is joining us from another one of those cities. Welcome, Sid. Where are you today?
Thanks, Sam. I feel like my introduction was quite generous. I'm probably not all of that was said. I'm in Montreal today and had the pleasure of visiting Concordia and McGill yesterday and walking the streets in such a fabulous city. So
Great.
Thank you, Sam.
No problem. Welcome all. And Sid, I'm quite confident, based on our overlay conversation this week, that that wasn't a generous, it was an accurate description. So before we jump into the panel, we had agreed, I wanted to just start by very briefly defining what we mean by campus policy today. So our emphasis for this conversation is primarily on changes that come about through student or campus level advocacy rather than on specific programs. So that is changes that students need to advocate for more broadly across campus, as opposed to individual programs or initiatives that they could launch themselves, or that they might persuade an individual administrator or manager to adopt. And in prepping for this panel, I had a little look up at the University of Guelph, which is where I'm based. And I don't know what it says about the nature of large organizations or even bureaucracies, but the University of Guelph has a policy on the creation of policies, which defines what a university policy is. So based on the University of Guelph policy on policies, it says that policies are university directives that provide guiding or governing principles to be followed in carrying out the activities of the university. Policies establish key requirements and responsibilities. Policies help establish compliance or ensure compliance with applicable laws and or advance the university's mission. Policies have broad implications throughout the university and are binding on members of the university community, and they are approved by the Board of Governors or the Senate. So what I took from that, we're dealing here with high-level responsibilities, principles to guide action, and goals. And importantly, these are things that are approved at the highest level, so they're likely to involve broad-based engagement across campus. One of the examples that I thought was particularly interesting was that U of G has a sexual violence policy, which lays out responsibilities, legal and otherwise, plus procedures for responding to incidents and allegations of sexual assault. It also has an academic accommodations policy, which provides some principles, has an investment policy, which sets criteria for how the university's endowment can be invested, and that is shaped heavily by the decarbonization movement. And there were a few things that struck me about these policies, but particularly the sexual violence policy, and I'm grateful to our panelists who helped me think this through earlier in the week. There's sort of 3 things about that sexual violence policy that stood out. The first is that I can imagine that almost every campus now has one. The second thing is that 20 or 30 years ago, I imagine the idea that every campus might have an explicit policy on sexual violence would probably have seemed unimaginable to advocates working then. And third, and I hope and sure most of you would agree, that the presence of sexual violence policies has not eradicated sexual violence on campus. So from what I see in that regard, sort of policies in this instance, the sexual violence policy suggests progress, but not necessarily a final success. and they're hopeful to some extent because change is clearly possible, but it's not always quick. And so for the purposes of this discussion, we're focused on policies. We'll broaden the definition a little slightly just to allow us to include some of the bigger strategic decisions that universities make, even if they're not formally enshrined in policy. So I'm thinking here, for example, the decision to be either a self-operated food environment where the university is running its own hospitality services, or where they make a decision to run through third-party operators. So those kinds of big strategic decisions. And with that, our plan for the discussion is really to organize it around two broad-based questions. The first, what policies would panelists like to see changed or implemented at the campus level? And secondly, how does policy change happen on campus? And so with that, I'd sort of like to open up to our panelists, and I'll maybe start with you, Sid. Sid, what's one policy change related to food and food security that you'd like to see on your campus?
Thanks, Sam. I think the generation that I think that we have right now in universities and the generations to come are quite passionate, and they care, unlike the generations that probably were prior to them. So sometimes I feel I want to be in that generation. In terms of policies, there are two pathways to policies, and I'll quickly, the conventional policy pathway is one that you articulated, Sam, which is work through the universities, get them multi-stakeholder engagement, write a policy. The other pathway, which I probably will talk a little bit more about, is to adopt the global. Sorry, was that me or no? No, all good. I'd suggest to adopt the SDGs. They were specifically written for this generation. They have very articulate goals on food insecurity. They have indicators, they have a framework, they have a sectorial framework. So there's a lot of work that has been done. So I'd probably, if I had to share how to get this done or which policy to champion, I'd say students need to get behind getting universities to get onto the SDGs and start doing meaningful work around them. Thanks, Sam.
No problem, Sid. A couple of things you mentioned. You contrasted the adoption of the SDGs with a conventional policy. What's the distinction in your mind?
No, conventional policy is that the university itself creates a policy, right? That talks to what it should do or what the community should do around food insecurity. Well, all that work is already done by the SDGs. So I'm kind of, and a lot of work that was done by the SDGs was in reflection so that the sectors, the countries, the provincial governments, municipal governments, and sectors don't have to do it. So it's broad enough and has indicators and has frameworks so that folks can start getting work done. So in my view, I skip all of that. We're an impatient generation, so to say. We want to get things done, and we get things done fast. And probably the SDGs is a way to go.
I see. And so that essentially it skips the policy formation. You can do away with the wordsmithing. You can adopt the goal.
Agreed.
Perfect. So I'm curious, from your point of view, you're responsible for food on the campus at SFU. If SFU adopted Zero Hunger as a target, as a guide, how would that influence the work that you do? What would you be able to do under that scenario that you can't currently do now?
Well, three things I'd be able to do more. One is I'd have broad leadership support. Without leadership support, you can't go anywhere. Two, there would be funding and resources to get things done. And three, we'd be able to measure the impact, which is sometimes I say it, if you don't measure, you can't improve. So you got to be able to measure the impact. 5 years back, I had visited SFU, not working for SFU, but presented to the SFU, the SDG framework. And 5 years later, I think last week, SFU announced that it is going to adopt the SDGs and come out with meaningful framework around that. I can get a little bit deeper into why it's important for universities and how students can work around it. But I'd obviously love to hear what Barb and Austin have to say.
Yeah, thanks for doing my job for me there, Sid. I'm glad you're the moderator. Barb, Austin, anything that jumped out of you from Sid's comments there?
Well, I was going to jump in and say that my big ask would rather be a provincial policy on tuition or provincial policies, because I know that each province is managed, education is managed at the provincial level. So I just think that it's a big ask, I know, but in the climate of neoliberal governance with deepening inequalities, I don't think we're going to be able to actually tackle food insecurity without having some really big changes in the way that our education system is organized. So we know that approximately 30 to 40% of students are facing food shortages, indebtedness, overlapping demands and responsibilities with school, work, family life, and the pandemic made things worse. We know that food insecurity is the result of not having enough money. So many students are precarious when it comes to income. And I would say that in Ontario, international student tuition is completely unregulated. So it's very unsustainable, not only for students, because students are seeing increases every year, but also for institutions, which the pandemic has shown us. International student tuition, is really propping up inadequate funding on public education. And we need the province to come to the table and talk to the institutions and to students and student groups about solutions. So in Ontario, again, domestic tuition is currently frozen. The previous Liberal government had actually implemented a free tuition policy for low-income Ontarians. And more recently, some schools in Ontario are starting to offer free tuition for international students in some graduate programs. So Brock University, U of T, but it needs to go much further. So I would say, we need to advocate on the issue of tuition. And we can do that on our campuses through either our student union or through student groups. There's an election coming up in Ontario next year, so there is an opportunity to kind of, get this into the public discourse. It seems so far off, but it really shouldn't be. And I guess then I would also say at the campus level, we can also advocate for tuition policies in our universities. And again, using the power of collective voice, either with student unions and student clubs, getting faculty on board. Every year, we typically see increases to tuition. And I've heard from lots of students how hard it is to plan when their tuition is going up every year. And especially with international students, again, we see really big increases in tuition. So universities can manage this at the university level. And I know even, based on some advocacy that we've been doing at Lakehead, recently we have seen a very small policy developed where there would be caps on how much international tuition could be raised in a year. So I think that's something that would be more, individually campus oriented, as opposed to that really big ask in terms of the provincial policy.
Yeah, that's excellent, Bob. Thank you. A couple of things came out. I mean, I think it's interesting you mentioned a couple of campuses are doing individual things. You actually answered one of the questions I was curious about, that, what are the signs on your own campus, not to put you on the spot, that kind of campus level policy is happening. And you mentioned that there's something has already come or something is in the works. Mm-hmm. Are you, in terms of international student fees, are you thinking, regulation? I know a couple of years ago, the University of Waterloo, for example, just made the increases predictable at a campus level. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking about? For those that to look at anything written about university finances, we know that international student fees is playing an increasingly significant role in the finance universities. What were you kind of looking for in terms of regulation of international student fees?
I think that's a bare minimum request that we should be working towards, right? I think universities have the ability to put those constraints in terms of increases, yearly increases. And I think, Lakehead is probably following suit in terms of what other universities have already done. But, I've heard from international students in interviews that I've done with students about their experiences of food insecurity, how, when they started in year one, their tuition was, a certain amount. And by year 3 and year 4, they've seen, significant increases every year. So students need to be able to plan. And so if they can know that their tuition is going to only increase by, I don't know, 0.5% each year, or no increases for the period of their 4-year degree, I think that would be something that we could really push universities to consider in terms of policy. Of course, that requires a collective response, right? It's not going to happen, unless we have a larger voice, kind of pushing for this sort of thing.
Excellent. Now, Austin, I'll bring you in here because I know your organization, USA, has advocated for changes to policies on international student fees in the past, and that your organization was heavily involved in the policy changes to student aid in Ontario a little while ago. I was curious, are you currently working on any policy changes in relation to tuition fees or changes to financial aid? And if you are, what kinds of things would you like to see on individual campuses that would support that work?
Yeah, totally. USA is definitely working on student affordability right now. It's actually one of our key advocacy priorities. In roughly 2 weeks or so, we're going to be going to do what we call LobbyCon. We're going to be meeting with as many members of provincial parliament as possible to communicate all of our recommendations for them. Part of this is us trying to give them ideas for the election coming up, as well as the current government to communicate what we want done right now, or for if they win again in the next election, to see if they can adopt some of our ideas to have affordability at the forefront for post-secondary education. We all know tuition is a massive drain on student finances. Specifically, I know international tuition at Brock University, it's increased roughly $1,500 per year for the last few years. So it's not predictable for these students. We are actually asking the provincial government to regulate international student tuition. We would like them to put a freeze or to put a cap of how much tuition could be increased. Along with that, we also want the reintroduction of the targeted free tuition program. And the last ask that we're focusing on right now for the next little bit for this short cycle is the elimination of parental and spousal contributions from the aid calculator, at least short term while we're in the pandemic. Specifically just because we've all been affected differently with how COVID has impacted finances. As well, there's a lot of gaps in the OSAP situation right now, with parents not actually contributing to students' finances. So right now, that's our main goals for financial aid and student affordability. But as to how individual campuses can support us, communicate to your staff, peers, students, anyone you can, but especially elected representatives. The more people who demand for change, the more likely it's going to happen. So just make sure you keep the conversation going. And that's what I have to say for that.
Excellent. Thanks, Austin. We've had a slightly Ontario focus here. So Sid, I'm curious from your point of view, you're based in BC at SFU. You are perhaps someone that's advocated to a lot. I was curious, what do you see your role as a senior administrator within the campus? I'm putting you on the spot here. How do you see your role within advocating or not around affordability? Do you need people to create the space for you to do work, or can you be part of that conversation as well?
Yeah, I think we play an extremely important role. Austin is right. I'm part of the student affordability working group, student union presidents, our graduate society, our undergrad society. And the number one thing on that committee's framework is food insecurity. So there's a natural interconnection between affordability and food insecurity on campuses. So, Sam, absolutely. In terms of BC and SFU, I think we are looking at it maybe three different ways. One is we've started doing things just out of necessity. Right through the 18 months, we've probably done 60 to 75,000 meals in our dining hall. This week, I think you will hear that we have launched our food fridge. I think we also gave space to the student societies for a food pantry. And we are thinking of it from a systems perspective across a framework that talks about access, affordability, and education. So how do we get access to our students across all three campuses on our community and outside of our community? Because not everybody comes to the campus. Affordability, how can we bring affordability, whether it's meals that are affordable or whether it's employment on campus that drives and helps with affordability. And third is education. Believe it or not, once our students come into our residences or into our campuses, how to spend that money wisely has been something that we've learned that we need to do a little bit more work on. So those are the three things that we are doing at SFU in terms of work. In terms of the policy work, coming back to the question that you originally asked, I think we're championing SDGs. Here's where the catch is: student advocacy works. It is an incredibly powerful tool that students have, and they're very good at it. I mean, the passion that I see is fantastic. Where the challenge is that the generation is passionate about a lot of things, and to find the focus is difficult. So I think student societies, that are led by folks like Austin, there needs to be some work done on focusing. And take climate change, for example, and the focus that is on climate change and the work that is happening there is fantastic. Um, Universities care for reputation, 100%. And so you got to find a way to either enhance their reputation or a risk to their reputation. So working along those paradigms around reputation will help you better advocate. And then, of course, university administrations also care for recognition, especially in their peer group. What is UBC doing? What's SFU doing? Or what's McGill doing? And what's Concordia doing? There is this friendly banter that goes back and forth. Sometimes it's very serious. And so I think along those lines, there is a very, very compelling argument around adopting serious policy on food insecurity.
Awesome. Thanks, Sid. So that's a really nice transition to kind of the second round of conversation then around what have our panelists learned about what successful campus level advocacy look like. Sid, you've mentioned there sort of the role of either strengthening or, for want of a better word, putting pressure or threatening a university's reputation and or peer group pressure. I don't know about you, but I find most universities want to be first, but they don't really want to be first. As long as someone else has done it somewhere else, that's a little risky, but they like to talk about being able to be the first. Barb and Austin, what are some things you've learned about successful student advocacy? Austin, I know, maybe I'll start with you. At Brock, student advocacy led to improvements in sports and rec facilities. Why do you think those kinds of efforts were successful?
Well, first and foremost, student advocacy to me is a long game. Oftentimes, you're going to need to coordinate multiple years of student leadership just to accomplish any of your goals. There's projects that we might not even see finished in our terms, and we just have to accept that. For example, like you said, we at Brock University used to have an exceptionally small rec facility. We had a gym that was like 3,000 square feet for a population of 16,000 students. Our student leaders roughly 5 years ago said that wasn't okay and we needed it expanded in order to enhance the health and wellness at our university. So over that span, every single student leader through that 5 years, so that's 5 different executive teams, had to consciously decide that, yes, I'm going to continue this effort and move on with it and continue, even though they knew that they weren't going to see it finished in their time. The only reason it was successful was because each team decided to continue. So one thing that I would say to every school and every union is that you need to create a strategic plan and you need to have long-term goals in order for you to be consistent. Have your priorities for the year based off of those long-term goals so you know how, or you can predict, or you can have something that you want done. For us, we want a student union building built right now. We have been in the works for 5 years, 6 years to get this done. It's probably going to take another 4 years for it to be finished. We have one currently, but we're creating a larger space so students can have more room for club activities, more room for social enterprise or events or whatever, study rooms, and it's entrenched in our strategic plan. But yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Awesome, thanks, Austin. And I'm curious, because I'm sure some of our students participating on the call today are not part of student government, some may well be. I'm curious, from your point of view, your organization has to make decisions on a yearly, I believe, if not longer timeline, about which topics to pick up, which topics and issues to pick up in your conversations with administration. I'm sure that you get a wide range of requests from student groups and students who are organizing. I'm just sort of curious, what are you looking for when you decide, okay, you know what, this is going to be, these are the 3 things we're going to advocate. Is it 3 things? Is it many things? Like, what are the things that help you make a decision? This is where we need to put our advocacy focus for the next year, the next 2 years. How are you making those decisions?
Like I said, we have a strategic plan. So we look at the strategic plan and see which priorities are going to help us move forward with the long-term goals. So anything that will help us move the long-term goals will be put on a list, and that list will be sent out to be made public, at least for our students to be able to vote to decide which ones that they value the most. We'll take that into account to see what students want, as well as what we think will be the most successful, what has the best chances for success, which ones we know probably won't be successful, but will still be meaningful to push forward. So the university admin knows that it's a topic that we care about. On top of that, we might just have little things that we see. I know we had some lecture halls that didn't have plugins, and students couldn't plug their laptops in and take notes. So that's a thing that was relatively easy to get done in a couple months working with our admin to implement some more outlets in lecture halls. Same thing with water fountains, so we can bring down waste in the university. So if there's like anything that is relatively small that we can probably get done in a few months to a year, or even smaller things like having a I don't know, extension to the winter break last year because of COVID travel. These are things that we'll tackle just because we know that it's something that we can get done easily, but long term, we're focusing on our strategic plan and how we can move forward with our long-term goals.
Excellent. So a couple of things I've heard there, Austin. You've got a blend of small asks and some longer term asks. You're sort of trying to weigh what priority students are articulating with what you think is going to be successful. I'm going to turn it to our other panelists here, Sid and Barb. From where you sit within your universities, what are the things you would look for to increase the chances that any policy ask is going to be, quote unquote, successful? On which one, if what conditions are you looking for that say, that's a great idea, but its time is not now? What are some of the things that make you think that this policy is going to stand a chance?
Well, I would just like to echo both what Austin and Sid have said already. So the first being, like, students' voices are really powerful. Administrators have to listen to students, and they actually want to listen to students, I think. So they don't always want to hear what they have to say, but they do have to listen, and they do want to, I think, at least we hear, this student-centered rhetoric, right? So students' voices are super important. The other piece that Austin reminded us of is that it's a long game. Policy is a long game. And I think I really appreciate your tying it to the strategic plan. And I'm imagining that's the student union strategic plan. But I would also, say from the perspective of Lakehead and working on the food security committee here, one of the things that we've done to some success is, linking our plans and our projects to the academic plan, the university strategic plan, And with food security in particular, we've linked it to the Okanagan Health Charter. So a lot of universities have signed on to the Okanagan Health Charter, and food security is mentioned in there specifically. So I think, at Lakehead right now, we've just spent several months kind of revisiting the framework for how our food security committee works. We have a food security committee. It's taken us 4 or 5 years to get to where we are now. On that committee, we now have a planning team. The planning team is equal representation of faculty, students, and administrators. And we meet really regularly every few weeks, as opposed to the larger food security committee, which is a bigger, broader committee of more voices. But one of the things that we're working on right now is developing a food charter for the university, because we figure that some of the policy changes that we want, like working towards this idea of zero hunger, or a rights-based approach to food on our campus, require us to have, again, sort of a framework that can hold administrators accountable, right? And so if you can link that to a strategic plan, an academic plan, in our academic plan, social justice features very strongly at Lakehead. And, food security, social inequality, inequities, on our campus, you can link food security to these things. So having a way to hold the administrators accountable is really important. And you can do that, I think, when you are creating policy or moving towards policy that is linked with those bigger plans.
Thanks, Bob. So I'm hearing a couple of things, and not to reveal the curtain fully, but Brenna, I saw your message about transitioning to the Q&A. Suman and I had a little chat and said we maybe go a little longer just to round out this particular conversation, so I haven't ignored that. Sid, so what I've heard from your first comments, and then from Austin, and then from Bob, if you have student voice and student engagement, the ask is focused, it's tied to a strategic plan, and the framing is salient. So in Barb's case, at Lakehead, it's been tied to the Okanagan Charter and that sort of well-being framework. 4 things there: student voice, it's a focused ask, it's tied to a strategic plan, the framing is salient. Is that the recipe for success? What's missing?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. First, to acknowledge that, Austin, you're being quite humble in terms of your job. I think student leaders have an incredibly tough job. You get 1-year terms at max, and you got to work with the Senate and work with other student leaders across the campus. So having a strategic plan is the right way to go. So congratulations on figuring that out, including getting all your credits done and then having a social life on Instagram and Twitter and everything else. It's pretty incredible. In terms of the framework, I'd say, yeah, I think along those lines, Sam, I'd say, at SFU, I'll just talk about SFU, right? SFU, we've signed on to the SDGs. Within the SDGs, we've signed on to many targets. Within those targets, there have been working groups. I'm the lead chair for the food working group. There is a lead chair for the transportation working group, and it's a multi-stakeholder group that reports to a steering committee of the VPs. So it's going right into leadership, right? And we all have to come up with a 5-year work plan that talks about tangible actions. And there is resourcing, and there is a framework through which we will measure that, and so on and so forth. So that has come through due to a number of things. But if you are starting out, I would say, look at a framework. Not every university is same, not every sector is same. So I'd mentioned earlier that look at reputation. Where is the reputation? Where does your university or college sit on the reputational spectrum? Look at leadership. Is your president in the 1st year or the 8th year of their term? Because the energy that they will bring will be different across the paradigm, and your ability to be successful. Where is the student voice? We had a hunger strike planned last week because SFU had not disinvested from fossil fuel. So guess what? The day before the hunger strike, SFU announced they were going to disinvest. So I think there is, where is the student voice? Where is the provincial and federal government along the policy framework, and then go at it from that perspective. And I think within that framework, you can come up with a really good advocacy campaign that can drive sustainable change. I kind of think that's the recipe for success. We're talking about food and recipe, and so I thought, bring it all together on that front.
Very good. I'm cognizant of the time, so maybe we'll shift to the Q&A. A reminder to our audience, if you have questions, post them in the chat. There's a couple that have been posted so far. Panelists, jump in, whoever feels comfortable to respond to this one. So someone asks, thinking about progress but not success in the context of sexual violence policies, do the panelists have any ideas on ways to ensure that policies that are put into place maximize their real, tangible effects on the realities of students' lived experiences?
So, can you repeat that question, Sam, again? Sorry.
Panelists have any ideas on ways to ensure that once a policy is put into place, essentially it's effective and achieves its target? The way the person asked it was, how do you ensure the policy actually has real, tangible effects on the realities of students' lived experiences?
Oh, yeah, measure. Come up with leading indicators and lagging indicators. Leading indicators are, is there a program, right? How many programs do you have? Where are they, right? Is that functional? Is that active? That's a leading indicator. A lagging indicator is how many students actually access those programs. Between the leading and lagging indicators, you can really measure things that you can't easily measure. You can measure it through leading and lagging indicators. And that framework works. And so I'd say that's how you start measuring it. Make sure you have a very nimble approach to policy making. So iterate, like the technology world, they go into huddles and they tend to scrum into minimum viable products. So don't let perfection get into the way of good, I guess. And make sure that the virtuous cycle works, right? Do something, learn from it, fix it, do something, learn from it, fix it. Really will get you incrementally towards a better world than it was last week.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would just add that you have to review those policies annually or every second year. And, the review can be, looking quantitatively at different indicators and measures. It can also be qualitative, talking to students and finding out, where are the gaps, who isn't being served by the policy as it was intended, and, reporting on that. Every good policy is only good, for a certain time. And then it's going to need to be revisited. I mean, that's the nature of it. And I think that's that cycle that you're describing, Sid.
Mm-hmm.
I see a bunch of questions in the chat.
Yes. This question from Krishna about, it seems like approaching a planning phase, so economically and socially sustainable alternatives to corporate food distributor contracts, which echoes a comment or a question that people had asked registering. And I think, if I'm understanding correctly, and jump in others, but how do you reconcile a socially just and yet affordable food environment on campus? Can you square those circles? I certainly add from the University of Guelph, one of the things they're very proud of is that they're good employers, which is important. So maybe I'll start with you, Sid.
Yeah, we have an entirely corporate food distribution model. So SFU doesn't self-op anything. We have partners and vendors. The one way we are doing this is we're writing everything in the contract. So in our commercial contract, we have a minimum 30% local procurement. In the contract, we have a minimum of 30 to 50% plant-based food. We have funds for sustainability initiatives. So we are writing our ambition and our values into the contract. We are also working with Feed BC, which is a provincial Ministry of Ag and Ministry of Food initiative to help other universities. So we have now written a playbook as to how to build these values and these initiatives into a commercial contract. And so that's how we're doing it. It's a little bit slower than self-op because it's a little complex. You got to keep pushing.
I have
Sid,
lots to add on this topic, but
go on there, Bob. Go on, Bob. No, go ahead. Go, Bob. I've got permission to go another 5 minutes. So
okay,
go ahead,
I just
Bob.
want to say, like with the food contracts, we have to be really careful. Those contracts are often invisible to students and stakeholders on campus, and they're not made visible. I think purposefully in a lot of ways. I know in my experience at Lakehead, after finally getting a hold of a contract with Airmark and looking it over, there are things in the contract that aren't being abided to. And it's actually not the food service provider that's the problem, it's actually the administrators. And for example, in our contract, we are supposed to have a committee that kind of oversees that the contract is actually being carried out, and that hasn't been happening on our campus. And we've had issues with, food insecurity resulting as from, the food service provider, food insecurity. And especially through the pandemic, and that really happened with a shortage of hours of operation and things like that. So I would just I guess caution us to again to that we really need to work to understand what those food service provider contracts are on our campuses, and it's not always easy, and that also might be a goal of policy, maybe in terms of like how are those contracts renewed, how are they reviewed, how are they overseen, and that sort of thing. So
Excellent. Austin, these comments here around the Bob's making around sort of transparency echo a comment we've had in the chat around any advice from you for student advocates in terms of ensuring transparency. So finding out about policies or service contracts that already are in place that may not be publicly available yet. Any tips or advice for students on that?
That's a difficult one. I would say first, find an ally in the administration if you can. So ask questions, have relationships. For me personally, I have one of the upper vice presidents in the administration who is very transparent, open with us. So ask him questions, and we have a great relationship. We will, for the most part, get anything we need from him, unless it's a little outrageous. But try and build connections with people. If somebody else has a connection already, ask for an introduction. If you have a connection with someone, introduce them to another advocate, and keep the relationships building. If you don't have a relationship, then look on the website, see who's in charge of what. Most universities have a list of which admin is, what their department is, and like what they do, and reach out yourself. Reach out to their secretary, reach out to someone who is in the department who might not be at the top, and just ask questions. And it's a trial and error process, all honesty.
I might just add from my own experience, some of my work is with municipalities, and Sid, you jump in here in case this raises any alarms, but universities are subject, like municipalities and other levels of government, to Freedom of Information Acts. And certainly in Ontario, the Privacy Commissioner of Ontario has said that by and large, most contracts are not revealing most contracts is not going to result in unfair competitive disadvantage. So I would guess that most university contracts would be Freedom of Information requestable. Sid's nodding, I think. So if any of our audience would like to go a slightly more combative route, that's one option. Sid, go ahead.
No, to be honest, actually, yeah, those contracts are available in terms of the scope, maybe not on the commercial side of it in terms of the commissions or the financial aspect of it, but at least the scope of work, what is and what cannot be done is available. And at SFU, I think there is a campaign right now out there that is talking about food service and facility services models. And we've hired Deloitte to do a bit of a study around it. And I think these big organizations like Compass and Aeromark also have reputational risk here. And one has to understand, without private sector, you can't make change. You need civil society, you need government, and you need private sector. And so the one way you can work, and private sector tends to work faster because they got to be relevant. They're publicly listed company and have shareholder value to deliver. If you can make sure, like 5 years back, I was in a boardroom and the cage-free egg society came into our boardroom and says, if you don't go cage-free in 5 years or within 5 years or make any commitments, we're going to the press. Guess what we did next day? We said we're going to go cage-free. Now, there is reputation, private sector can do it. We think that with our food service provider at SFU, we have robust contractual language to deliver on these commitments and a framework to change those commitments as we learn and go on this journey. And I think one shouldn't walk away from that, because private sector does bring a lot of skills that public sector or civil societies don't have. So we have to find a way to work together.
Awesome. Thank you, Sid. We're rapidly getting to the real hot stop. Suman gave me 11:55. Was there anything any of our final panelists wanted to say to our audience?
There's one question here. How does one start an effective student-led food security initiative? I'd say just start working with Meal Exchange.
That seems like a very good note to end on. Yeah, like
Yeah.
3 thumbs up from Suman.
Yeah.
Apparently, Sid's the only panelist who was on a retainer.
Well, I have one complaint here. Meal Exchange is Ontario focused. They need to be a little bit more broader. So hopefully we can get a little bit more work done in BC.
That's a terrific.
We are all ears, Sid. We are all ears.
So thank you. Oh, sorry, Bob. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I do have to say that a lot of the work that we have done and continue to do at Lakehead was initiated with the assistance of Meal Exchange as well. So I can't say enough about Meal Exchange.
This is where we all earn our speaker fees. I'm going to agree that your work at U of G is heavily down to Meal Exchange. So at that time, Suman, I'm going to hand back to you to close us out.
Outstanding. Thanks a lot, Sam, and thanks, Barb, Sid, and Austin. This was such an amazing and very informative session. A lot of students do have this question and doubt, how can they start on the campus level? So this was amazing. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for speaking. And thank you for the Meal Exchange plug. We love that, of course. That's so important. But in all fairness, I think we are going to take a couple of minutes break. Don't go too far. Just get a refill of your water, use the restroom if you need to. And we're going to jump into our next session, which is a provincial session. And I think Barb briefly mentioned, and I'm letting the cat out of the bag, but briefly mentioned about free tuition that our previous government in Ontario implemented very successfully. So we're going to talk about that in the next session. And we're going to hear from a couple of people who really made it happen. So take a quick break. Let's see you in at 12 o'clock, sorry, Eastern time.